my friends, and welcome to What's Up. Nice to have you here. I'm John Petersen from the Arlington Institute, and I'm joined every 2 weeks, fortnightly, by my friend Gregg Braden, and we just have a chat. Hi, Gregg. How are you?
Hey, John, it's good to see you. I'm happy to be with you, and it looks like a really interesting conference that you're attending right now.
It's a great conference, and it's really fun. Aaron Murakami does just a great job of bringing together the kind of the leading edge of the acolytes of Nikola Tesla and Eric Dollard, and there's lots of really cool stuff going on here in terms of alternative energy and science and so on. And it's not a giant crowd at all, but it's really a kind of a nice intimate gathering of those who are trying to really push the envelope in terms of magnetic motors and other such things. You ought to come sometime.
Well, you have mentioned that you'd like to join me on my Chaco Canyon tours. I would like to join you at that conference sometime.
That can be arranged. I have influence. Yeah.
I know you know people in high places there.
Yeah, good.
So let me ask this, John.
What you been thinking about?
Well, I'm thinking about the conference that you're at right now, and I'm curious if the topic, one of the big topics in the world right now, and you and I have spent some time talking about this, is disclosure. And does the idea of disclosure come up at this conference, and the implications for energy systems in the world, and the way we think of energy and how we use energy in our lives? Is that a topic that is part of the conference?
I don't remember it having been a part of disclosure. They've talked about kind of disclosure in the past. One presentation that I remember, and certainly there's all kinds of it lays underneath a lot of the talk about the different kind of techniques and things about energy and propulsion and stuff. But it's not a centerpiece of what we do here.
I think it's one of the big when we think about the idea of disclosure. And what it means different things to different people. I was at a conference recently. It was my conference in Arizona, and people were in Q&A asking about disclosure, and a woman raised her hand and she said, "What is disclosure?" So there are people out there that are in the loop, people out of the loop, and we found that it means very different things. But I think one of the biggest implications certainly has to do with the technology that would be revealed through the propulsion sources and how we could apply that in our lives. And when you think about that, maybe it gives us some insight into the resistance for disclosure. There are people that would prefer that we not have that kind of technology in our lives.
But it's interesting. On the way driving out here, I stopped in Colorado Springs, and I had lunch with David Grusch and spent a couple hours talking to him, who, of course, for those who are watching this that are not familiar with, he is the senior intelligence official who came forward a couple of weeks ago and said that the United States has crafts. We not only have craft, we're reverse engineering the things. We've got materials. And we have biology, we have bodies and stuff, and it's fascinating when you talk to the guy. First of all, I think he's as straight as an arrow. I mean, I think he's good-hearted, and he has he's trying to do what's right. And I asked him straight up, are they? Who's pulling your chain? Who's behind you? Who's saying? Because I know you're not out here just freelancing because you're alive. And if you were just freelancing, you probably wouldn't be sitting here talking to me. He says, no. He said, nobody's hassling me. Once I got through the process of trying to get through the inspector general and got cleared and everything, then no, I get to choose what I'm doing. And I pushed him on it. And he said, I'm not, what he implied was he's not stupid. He's not going to do dumb things. But what I've come to, the conclusion I've come to is that there's a tacit acceptance or decisions been made somewhere at some level in the system that is allowing this all and saying the time is right. Let's do this, which
Yeah.
again raises the question that we talked about in quartet, which is why? Why now? I mean, why? What's behind all of this? And with all due respect, I don't think it's just Stephen Greer pushing, or
No.
David Wilcock or whoever, all the other people in the space, which they are, and it's an element, but they're not just responding to those guys. There was something else bigger.
Energy companies. My first job out of college, I worked in the energy industry, and they were resistant to any kind of technology that required even less fossil fuels. There was a carburetor that would get 90 miles to the gallon in 1979. And the energy companies bought that patent and just sat on it so that it couldn't be used in the automotive industry. So it's the power structures, I think, that are having the problem.
And they're intrinsically myopic, right? They are intrinsically short-sighted. That there is no big grand strategy in the military or in the intelligence community or the State Department or the White House, for that matter. The whole system is all reactive, and it's this short term, like I say, this adhocracy kind of stuff, and you can't do that with an event that's as big as not just disclosure, which is giant, and it pulls the pins out from underneath, religion and history and technology and science and who knows what, cosmology, and but everything else is moving at the same time, and so we can't just sit around and hope for the best. And there are a lot of very well-meaning people who are all doing their part, but they're in different kind of sectors and areas and techniques and approaches. But there needs to start to come together with a whole new kind of integrated approach.
I was listening to an interview that Stephen Greer was doing, and someone was asking, and the interviewer was asking him, what happens the day after disclosure? What does that mean? And one of the things he said was, we have an end to fossil fuels. And I understand
that's
what
really trite. That's a real trite fact,
Well, it is
how that works.
But also, I don't think it's accurate. I think we have an end to burning fossil fuels in internal combustion engines as a source of power. But interestingly, oil, and this is fascinating to me, John, natural oil is one of the few products that we know, one of the few compounds that cannot be duplicated in the laboratory. We can't recreate oil. We use petroleum in over 6,000 applications in our daily lives that we don't even think about without burning it. So just because we stop burning it for fuels, we would still need that industry to create the products for the components in the computer that's allowing me to connect with you, in the medical industry. And we have no replacement for the rubber tubings that bring life supporting fluids into our bodies. You think about, you can't use a bamboo, tube to do that. We don't have any way to replace it. I don't think it would be the end of an industry. It would make that industry more efficient.
It'd be a massive kind of change. And that was the point I was trying to say, is that you'd have to look a decade or 2 decades down the road to be able to say, yeah, we transitioned out of something. Hal Puthoff, who was famous for starting the remote viewing program, is an old friend of mine, and he has been working in the alternative energy space for a long time, particularly cold fusion. And he was not worried about, but was interested in, what would be the transition and how would this happen. And he tells a story of that he ran around to all these big oil companies and sat down with the appropriate person inside the company and said, listen, what would you do if we suddenly found out there was another way to do all of this kind of stuff? And they said, hey, what a good deal. We make a whole lot more money on pharmaceuticals and makeup and whatever, all the other kind of things that they use this for, and that they would think that it was a good idea. Well, who knows?
Well, Oh,
Yeah.
Go ahead, John. Sorry.
Yeah, that's all right. Go
Well,
on.
I was just saying it takes fossil fuel energy to create the fossil fuels to
Yeah,
pull it out of the
sure.
ground. So
Sure.
if they're using an alternative source of energy, they don't have to burn fuel to get the oil out of the ground. That's
I
gonna
know.
it's
I
gonna be
mean,
better for them,
no.
more efficient for them.
And right now, there's no alternative. I mean, all this stuff of electric cars is foolish. It's just that
Yeah.
it's a losing idea. You just trying. I drove across the plains and looked at all these big windmills and said, trying saying what are they going to do with those when they quit? And you can always see that there's about 10% of them that aren't running because they're broken. And God, I mean. And you do a life cycle analysis of the economics, and there's no way
No,
that,
no.
that
Well,
they make any
it
sense.
it is fossil fuel intensive to create the windmills to begin
Sure.
with in that phase. And then a lot of people don't know you have to use diesel engines to start the windmills before they can even begin running. But even beyond
That's
that,
got to be a
John,
secret, big secret.
the batteries that for these electric cars and the chips, all of this is run on what are called 17 rare earth elements that are in primarily in two concentrations, one in China and one in Russia, now our friendliest allies. And they're finite sources. Some of them come from meteorite impacts. Once we've mined those meteorites, that's why they're rare earth elements. We're not going to be able to use them. So it doesn't make sense. But right behind your head, I'm looking at a picture of Nikola Tesla. And yeah, and I was a member of the Tesla Society back in the 70s and through the late 90s in Colorado Springs is where we used to have the meetings. I was an engineer for Martin Marietta up in Denver during the Cold War years. And what we're looking at, the potential of the energy sources that could be revealed through disclosure work very differently from what Tesla was talking about. Tesla was talking about creating what's called broadcast energy, where you're broadcasting through the towers into the atmosphere, and then people pick it up like you do a television signal in your television.
Eric Dollard replicated that in a small scale model here a couple of years ago.
Yeah, well, but that was the principle that he's working on. But what the propulsion systems that are indicated through what we have so far in disclosure are very, very different. They would result in every home and every automobile having a little device that is pulling that energy from the Planck vacuum and converting it to something useful in that device. So you're no longer using, power lines. You don't need power lines. You don't need antennas. You don't need anything like that. You've got one, in your car. You've got one in your house. You've got one, where in your truck or wherever it is that you need it. These are very, very different principles from what Tesla proved the point that the Earth is a resonant field. He proved that the resonance of the Earth. When you see those big sparks flying off I've got his lab notes from a copy of his lab notes from 1899. And this is what he was showing was those sparks only happen when the resonance is reached between his coils and the Earth. So he proved that resonance was there. That wasn't the purpose of what he was doing, but it was an indication that he was right on with what he was doing. And he had so many applications of how that resonance could be applied. But what David Grusch is talking about, those kinds of propulsion systems, they're not using Tesla technology. They're doing something very, very different. And it would suddenly revolutionize. It would allow every human on the face of the earth that wanted energy to have it without being attached to a cable, without having to burn anything.
Decentralize the whole thing. Just intermediate the whole process.
Well, with zero greenhouse gases and with no, people I know that have worked in the industry, and this was in the 80s, they were working with this stuff in the 80s. So I can only imagine how far it has advanced since that time. But there was no, ozone implications or anything. This is, literally tapping the fluctuations in the Planck field and then translating those minute fluctuations,
Yeah.
amping them up into something that is kinetic and useful in our lives.
Aggregating them. Yeah.
So
Well,
I think, you know, when we talk about the people that are pushing back on disclosure, that don't want that disclosure, the term you used was myopic, and I think it's right on. They're saying is, what do we lose when this
yeah.
happens, rather than how can we benefit? How does this benefit everyone? And it doesn't mean that entire industries need to go away. We'll still make automobiles. They're going to run on a different kind of engine. And, you know, we'll still need oil for all the other 599,000 applications. That force that you're talking about, I think it's a biological imperative. And we see this in nature, where nature will create complex systems. They become more and more complex until they cannot sustain themselves under the burden of their own complexity. So what those systems will break down, but they don't go back to zero. They break down to give way to a higher order. And I think this is what we're doing. We're seeing a civilization break down to give way to a higher order.
You get an implosion of the present system, which gives you a vacuum for the emergence of the next stage. And all I'm saying is that, you know, you can sit around and wait for the whole thing to come together, which it hopefully will all by itself, or we can get out in front of the thing and say, let's design the world. Let's make this go the direction we want it to do. What a great opportunity. I mean, it's,
yeah. I agree. You know, John, I'm inspired every time I speak with you and we have this conversation. You inspire me tremendously. And I know we're getting close to the end of our time for this conversation. So I want to thank everyone that's at that conference, everyone that's watching in our live audience, and all the people that have dedicated their lives to understanding fundamental principles of life, nature, and energy to develop the alternative systems, because we can't wait for the day we need them to start trying to figure it out. Now we've got them to fall back on and parallel systems. And I just wanted to acknowledge the people that make that happen. So
thank you. That's kind of you. And I also want to thank all of those who are our viewers who come and follow, show up here every couple of weeks. And as much as it pains me, I would like to encourage you to do what Google wants you to do and punch the button and say yes, and, you know, and subscribe and all those kinds of things, because it's the only game in town right now. And it's a game this space we have to play in, and it helps. It helps a lot. So if you subscribe or like this or share it, we'd really appreciate it. Thanks, Greg. Nice to talk to you. See you.
Thanks so much, John. I look forward to our next. Travel safe.